That night was undoubtedly the most intense and exhilarating night of my entire life. It was an ordinary Tuesday. One of those quiet, uneventful evenings where the world outside seems to stand still, offering an almost surreal sense of peace and security. The kind of night where everything feels so still that it lulls you into a state of tranquility, convincing you that nothing could possibly disrupt the calm. I had been drained from work more than usual, the exhaustion weighing heavily on me, and I welcomed the idea of sleep with open arms. My body longed for rest, and my mind craved the sweet escape of slumber. I thought I had nothing to worry about once my head hit the pillow. But, as life often does, it had other plans. For the past 8 years, I had walked the challenging but rewarding path of being a single mom. Ever since my ex-husband and I parted ways. Our divorce wasn't messy or filled with hostility, it was simply a case of two people who had grown apart over time. Raising my son, Jamie, on my own had been both a profound joy and an overwhelming challenge. He was my world, my anchor. Intelligent, compassionate, and undeniably kind. Jamie brought so much light into my life. And yet, the weight of being both mother and father often wore me down. Especially during the quieter moments when the demands of parenting seemed endless. That night, exhaustion hit me harder than usual. And I barely had the energy to change into my pajamas before I collapsed into bed. The house was silent around me. Jamie had already retreated to his room hours earlier, after finishing up a night of video games and schoolwork. I found solace in the quiet, a rare moment of solitude I cherished. The only source of light came from the soft glow of the moon, which seeped through the thin curtains, casting delicate shadows across the room. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, sinking into the comfort of my bed, grateful for its warmth after a long day. The moonlight bathed the room in an ethereal glow, and I could feel the tranquility settle into my bones. As I lay there, lost in the soft, dim light, my mind wandered to life, what had been, what was, and what might come. It had been a peaceful stretch of time recently, which felt like a rare gift after the tumultuous year that had passed. Jamie and I had navigated so much together. Just the two of us. After his father's departure, our bond had only grown stronger, and we had found our rhythm in this new chapter of our lives. Though Jamie was nearly 20 now, the bond between us remained just as strong, perhaps even deeper than before. He was thoughtful and perceptive, always attuned to the needs of others. Sometimes, I wondered if he had assumed more responsibility than any young man his age should bear. I smiled softly to myself as I thought of him, remembering his selflessness and the gentle way he navigated the world. He was a young man with a heart far larger than most. But tonight, I was too tired to dwell on these thoughts for long. My eyelids felt heavy, my body relaxed, and I was on the cusp of surrendering to sleep when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knock on my bedroom door. At first, I barely stirred, my thoughts hazy as I hovered between wakefulness and sleep. The knock came again, gentle yet persistent, pulling me from the fog of slumber. "Mom," a soft voice called, barely above a whisper. But it was enough to break through my grogginess. I blinked and focused, my mind slowly adjusting to the dim light in the hallway, where I could just make out the shadow of Jamie standing in the doorway. I propped myself up on my elbows, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. "Jamie, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice thick with drowsiness. There was a hesitation in the way he stood, A slight uncertainty. As if he wasn't sure whether he should be there. I couldn't sleep, he murmured. His voice barely audible. He stood there. Distant yet close. As though he was unsure how to approach the situation. Concern welled up inside me. Jamie had been having trouble sleeping for some time now. Ever since the divorce. It wasn't something he spoke about openly. But I could sense it. I knew it troubled him more than he let on. His father's absence had affected him deeply. And though he tried to hide it, there were nights when the weight of it seemed too heavy to bear alone. "Come here," I said. My voice soft. Inviting him in. "You can stay with me tonight if you want." There was a pause. A moment where I saw the internal battle play out in his eyes. He was no longer the little boy who used to crawl into my bed for comfort, he was almost an adult now. Yet the vulnerability in his eyes spoke volumes. After a beat, he slowly crossed the room and climbed into bed beside me. He settled on his side, facing me. And I immediately noticed the exhaustion etched into his face. It wasn't just the tiredness of a long day, there was something else in his expression. A quiet sadness. A yearning that he didn't often show. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked gently. My heart aching for him. Jamie shook his head. His dark hair falling over his forehead as he turned his face slightly away. "No," he said quietly. "I just wanted to be close to you." My heart swelled with emotion. It had been so long since he had sought comfort this way. As he used to when he was younger. Without a word, I reached out, brushing his hair back from his face, and offered him a small smile. "That's okay," I whispered, my voice full of love and reassurance. "You can stay as long as you need." Jamie's lips twitched upward in a faint smile. But his eyes still carried that unspoken weight. There was so much he wanted to say. But he wasn't ready yet. I didn't push him. Instead, I lay back, pulling the blanket up over us both, allowing the stillness of the room to envelop us. For a while, we didn't speak. The room was quiet, save for the sound of our breathing, slowly sinking in the peaceful rhythm of shared comfort. Jamie's breath deepened, his body relaxing against mine. And I thought he had fallen asleep. But then, his voice broke the silence once more. "Mom, do you ever miss him?" The question hung in the air, delicate and unexpected. It caught me off guard. But I knew exactly who he meant. It was a question I had been avoiding for some time. One I hadn't been sure how to answer. I paused for a moment, taking in the weight of the question. "I do. Sometimes," I said quietly, my voice soft with the remnants of old pain. "But you know, things weren't good between us. We both made mistakes. And we couldn't fix them." Jamie nodded, though his eyes remained on me, seeking something more. Something I wasn't sure I could give. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he asked, his voice almost pleading for reassurance. I sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the past settle on my chest. "Maybe," I admitted. "But we can't change what happened. All we can do is keep moving forward." A heavy silence followed. Jamie stared down at his hands, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the blanket. "I guess I just wonder if I could have done something different," he said quietly. "If maybe I could have been better. Maybe if I had, things would have turned out differently." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. The guilt in his voice was unbearable. And I felt a surge of protective instinct wash over me. "Jamie, I said firmly, sitting up and turning to face him. No. You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault. But his voice, barely above a whisper, cracked with emotion. But sometimes, it feels like it is, he said. His eyes filled with unshed tears. Like if I had just been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left. The words shattered me. Tears welled up in my eyes. And I pulled him into my arms, holding him tight. For a moment, he resisted, unsure of himself. But then he relaxed, allowing me to comfort him. His head rested against my shoulder, and I felt the tension in his body slowly ease. Listen to me, Jamie, I whispered, my voice trembling. Your dad's leaving had nothing to do with you. It was his choice, not yours. You did nothing wrong. You are enough. You always have been. He nodded slowly. But I could feel the lingering doubt in his body. The weight of a burden he had been carrying alone for far too long. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, just holding each other. Slowly, his breathing steadied, becoming deeper and more rhythmic. And I knew he was finally beginning to fall asleep. I stayed awake a little longer, my mind racing with the weight of our conversation, the unspoken truths hanging between us. But as I held Jamie close, something stirred within me, something unexpected. There was a warmth that spread through me. Not just the warmth of a mother's love, but something deeper. It was a quiet, comforting realization that no matter what we had gone through, we were still here, together. And that, in itself, was enough. I tried to push it away. I tried so hard to focus on the steady rhythm of Jamie's breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, the softness of his skin against mine. But no matter how much I tried, the feeling lingered, hovering just beneath the surface. Elusive, waiting for me to confront it. I couldn't shake it, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. There, in the quiet darkness, with the only sound the soft exhale of my son beside me, I realized something that filled me with both unease and inevitability. Things were changing between us. I could feel it. I had always been the one who provided comfort for Jamie, who held him when he cried, who soothed him when he had nightmares. But now, as I lay there, clutching him a little too tightly in the silence of the night, it felt different. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant, for what it was about to bring into our lives. And in that moment, as my fingers brushed lightly through his hair, I knew that this was only the beginning of something I hadn't anticipated. The next morning came too quickly, as mornings often do when your mind is restless and the weight of unspoken thoughts lingers. The sun's first light crept through the curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. And I woke up far earlier than I had planned. I hadn't been ready to face the day, to return to the world outside of our little bubble. Jamie was still asleep beside me, his face serene in the quiet morning light. The tension that had gripped him the night before, like a tight knot in his chest, was now gone. And his expression was calm, innocent even. I watched him for a while, just breathing, just being my son. My heart swelled with that familiar, unshakable love that every mother feels for her child. But even beneath that love, something stirred. That same feeling, the one I had tried to push away last night, was there again. I couldn't quite name it, but I couldn't ignore it either. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, not wanting to disturb his sleep, and made my way downstairs to the kitchen. The ritual of making breakfast, flipping pancakes, brewing coffee, setting the table, was a small comfort. Something to anchor me while my mind wandered. But it wasn't enough to distract me entirely. As I stood at the stove, the warmth of the griddle filling the air, my mind drifted back to the conversation Jamie and I had had in the middle of the night. He had always been sensitive. My Jamie. I knew that. Of course. But I hadn't realized just how deeply he had internalized everything, the pain, the confusion, the guilt surrounding his father's departure. The fact that he hadn't shared his feelings with me until now struck me with a heavy blow. How had I not noticed sooner? I should have seen the signs. Should have reached out to him earlier. Should have done more. But there was something else. Something more complicated. Something that went beyond guilt. There had been a shift in the way Jamie had looked at me the night before. The way he had sought comfort in my arms was different. It was more than just a child needing their mother. It felt like he was reaching for something deeper, something more intimate. Something unspoken. And the truth was, I had felt it too. The warmth I felt when I held him. The quiet peace that settled in my chest when he curled up against me, those moments weren't just about maternal protection. They were about something more. Something I couldn't quite define. I tried to push the thought away. I couldn't, no. I wouldn't allow myself to go down that path. He's just a boy. I reminded myself. Even though the voice inside me trembled. He's just your son. But the feeling lingered. Stubborn and unshakable. As I flipped another pancake. Soon, I heard Jamie stirring upstairs. The soft thud of his feet against the floor signaling that he was awake. Moments later, he appeared in the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and yawning. His hair was a tangled mess. His lanky frame still growing into itself. In that moment, he looked like the child he was, my boy. Caught in the awkward in-between of adolescence. The boy who needed me. I forced a smile, trying to push away the tangled emotions from the night before. Morning. Sleepyhead. I greeted him, sliding a plate of pancakes in front of him. He mumbled a sleepy morning and sat down, immediately digging into the food like he hadn't eaten in days. I watched him for a moment, my eyes lingering on the way his shoulders hunched over his plate. How his fingers worked with a slight unease. We ate in quiet companionship. The sunlight streaming through the windows, casting a soft, golden glow over the kitchen. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it felt heavy. As though we both knew there was something unsaid. Something waiting to be addressed. Every now and then, I felt his gaze flicker toward me, brief. Almost imperceptible. But enough to make my stomach tighten. Finally, Jamie broke the silence. Thanks for last night, Mom, he said quietly. His voice thick with emotion. I needed that. I looked up, startled by the vulnerability in his words. I hadn't realized how much my presence had meant to him. How much he had needed me. You don't have to thank me, Jamie, I said softly, my heart swelling with love. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. He nodded. But there was something else in his eyes, something he wasn't saying. Something he couldn't quite put into words. Do you ever think things could have been different? He asked. His voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. My chest tightened as I remembered the painful years. The loneliness. The frustration. Maybe, I said. The weight of the past pressing down on me. But we can't change what happened. All we can do is move forward. Jamie seemed to consider that for a moment. His eyes downcast. Fingers absently tracing the edge of the table. I guess I just wonder if I could have done something differently, he murmured. If maybe I had been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left. His words were a dagger to my heart. How could he possibly think that? How could he blame himself? I reached over. My hand instinctively finding his. Jamie. No. I said. My voice trembling with the force of my feelings. You didn't do anything wrong. None of this was your fault. But sometimes it feels like it is, he whispered. His voice barely audible. The pain in his words so raw it almost shattered me. Like if I had just been better. Maybe Dad wouldn't have left. The tears welled up in my eyes. And before I could stop myself, I pulled him into my arms. He resisted for a moment. Unsure. But then he melted into the embrace. His body shaking with silent sobs as he buried his face in my shoulder. Jamie. I whispered. Holding him tighter. Listen to me. Your dad's leaving had nothing to do with you. He made his choices. And those choices were not yours to bear. You've always been more than enough. Okay. You're my everything. He nodded against me. But I could still feel the weight he was carrying, this burden that he had been shouldering for so long. Alone. And for the first time, I realized just how deeply his father's departure had affected him. We stayed like that for a while. Just holding each other. Allowing the silence to heal us. Slowly. The tension in Jamie's body began to ease. His breathing steadier. After a few minutes, I could tell he was drifting back into sleep. But I stayed awake. My mind racing with thoughts of everything that had happened. Of all we had both endured. And yet, as I held Jamie close, there was something else I hadn't expected, a warmth that spread through me. Deep and unsettling. It wasn't just the warmth of a mother's love for her child. As familiar and comforting as it was. It was something more, something deeper. Something that both comforted and unsettled me at the same time. I tried to push it away. To focus on the steadiness of his breathing. But it lingered. A presence just below the surface. Waiting to be acknowledged. And as I lay there in the darkness, holding my son close, I realized that things between us were changing. But I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant. This, I realized, was only the beginning. The morning came far too quickly. The soft rays of the early sunlight crept through the curtains, stirring me from a deep, restless sleep. I wasn't quite ready to face the day. The world outside felt too harsh. Too demanding. Jimia, still peacefully asleep beside me, looked serene, his face calm and relaxed. Free from the weight that had been burdening him the night before. The tension I'd seen etched on his features had melted away, leaving behind the familiar face of the boy I knew and loved. For a moment, I watched him, my heart swelling with a protective, warm feeling of maternal love. A deep sense of gratitude that he was still here with me. Safe and sound. But as I looked at him, another feeling stirred beneath the surface. One that unsettled me. It was the same feeling I had tried to push away the night before, the feeling I couldn't quite identify. But one that lingered stubbornly in the quiet corners of my mind. It was strange and unfamiliar. Something that both comforted and confused me in equal measure. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb his slumber. I needed space to think. To sort through the whirlwind of emotions I hadn't yet come to terms with. As I made my way downstairs to prepare breakfast, I found myself lost in thought. My mind drifted back to our conversation from the night before. Jimia had always been a sensitive child, but I hadn't fully realized just how deeply he had internalized the pain of his father's departure. The guilt he had been carrying for so long was something I should have seen earlier, his need to protect me, to shield me from the truth, had kept me from recognizing the depth of his struggle. The fact that he had only shared his feelings with me now, so much later, left an ache in my chest. It was a mother's ache, sharp and full of regret, for not being more attuned to his quiet pain. But there was more. There was something else that had shifted between us. Something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the weight of his words, but the way he had looked at me, different than before. The way he had sought comfort in my arms, as if crossing an invisible boundary between needing me as his mother and searching for something deeper. Something more. The warmth that had spread through me when I held him, the way his presence calmed the storm inside me, was no longer just maternal instinct. There was a tenderness in that moment, a closeness that felt like it transcended the usual boundaries of our relationship. I shook my head, trying to dispel these thoughts. He's just a boy, I whispered to myself, trying to regain my sense of normalcy. Your son. But even as I said the words, the feeling refused to leave. As I stood at the stove, flipping pancakes and focusing on the mundane task of breakfast preparation, I found it hard to ignore the nagging sensation that had crept into my thoughts. My mind kept returning to that look in Jimia's eyes, that subtle shift between us. Was it possible that he, too, was feeling something more than just the simple comfort of a mother's embrace? I couldn't allow myself to entertain such thoughts. It was wrong, wasn't it? I pushed the feelings away, concentrating on the pancakes. It wasn't long before I heard the soft thud of footsteps on the stairs. Jimia appeared, rubbing his eyes sleepily, his hair still messy from sleep, looking more like the little boy he once was than the almost grown teenager he was becoming. His lanky frame was still adjusting to the awkwardness of adolescence. But in that moment, he seemed innocent again, his youthful vulnerability shining through. Morning, sleepyhead. I greeted him warmly, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. Morning, he mumbled, his voice still thick with sleep as he sat down and began to eat without much enthusiasm, the weight of last night's conversation still hanging between us. We ate in silence for a while, the sound of our forks against plates filling the space between us. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a soft, golden glow over the kitchen. But the warmth of the light did little to ease the tension I felt. I knew Jimia was glancing at me from time to time, but neither of us spoke about the night before. I wasn't ready to bring it up yet. He seemed better this morning, more like himself, and I wasn't about to stir up any emotions he wasn't ready to face. Finally, Jimia broke the silence. His voice was quieter than usual, laced with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. Thanks for last night, Mom. I really needed that. I looked up at him, taken aback by the sudden sincerity in his voice. You don't have to thank me, Jamie. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. He nodded, but his eyes, those soft, searching eyes, held a depth that unsettled me. They were still filled with gratitude. Yes, but there was something else there now. Something unspoken. It reminded me of the way he had looked at me in the dark, when he thought I couldn't see him. His gaze lingered a moment longer than usual, and I felt a strange tightening in my chest. The rest of the day passed without much incident. Jimia retreated to his room, either doing homework or lost in video games, while I occupied myself with household chores. But the air between us had changed, subtle, but palpable. There was an unspoken understanding now, a silent awareness that seemed to hang in the space between us. It wasn't anything overt, nothing I could point to and say, "This is it," but the shift was there. A quiet tension, an invisible thread that connected us in a way that made everything feel different. As evening descended, I found my thoughts returning again and again to Jimia. I thought about how much he had changed in the past few years, how he was becoming his own person, shaping himself into someone distinct from the boy I had known. But more than that, I found myself thinking about the closeness we had shared the night before, the way he had fit so naturally into my arms, the comfort we had found in each other's presence. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my feelings weren't just those of a mother, they were something more. Something I wasn't ready to understand fully, but something undeniable. After dinner that night, Jimia and I sat together on the couch, watching a movie. The room was bathed in a dim, comforting light, the flickering glow of the television casting long shadows across the walls. We didn't speak much. Neither of us seemed to need words. We were content, simply being near each other. But as the movie went on, I became increasingly aware of the way Jimia was sitting so close to me, how his arm brushed against mine every time he shifted. My heart raced in my chest, and I tried to focus on the film. But the tension between us was undeniable. It hung in the air like a delicate, fragile thread that neither of us dared to break. Halfway through the movie, Jimia shifted again, leaning a little closer. His arm brushed against mine once more, but this time he didn't pull away. Instead, he let his arm rest against mine, the warmth of his skin sending a rush of heat through my body. I stole a quick glance at him, and he looked back at me with eyes that seemed softer, deeper, full of something I couldn't name. Affection. Yes. But also something more. Something raw and unspoken. Without thinking, I reached out and took his hand in mine. Our fingers intertwined, the simple act sending a jolt of electricity through me. Jimia didn't pull away. Instead, he squeezed my hand gently, his thumb brushing over my skin in a way that made my heart flutter. We stayed like that for a while, the world outside fading away as we held hands in the dim light of the living room. Neither of us said a word. There was no need. The connection between us was deeper than words could express. It felt like a turning point, a quiet shift in the fabric of our relationship. I didn't know what it meant yet, and I wasn't ready to examine it too closely. But I knew, deep down, that things were changing. Jimia wasn't just my son anymore. He was something more, someone I cared for in a way that was beyond the bounds of maternal love. The movie ended, the credits rolling on the screen. But we didn't move. I leaned my head against Jimia's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. It was a small gesture, but it felt intimate, more intimate than anything we had shared before. "Mom." Jimia's voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah," I replied softly, looking up at him. I'm really glad you're here. I don't know what I'd do without you." My heart swelled with emotion, and I squeezed his hand again, tighter this time, as if to anchor myself in that moment. "I'm glad I'm here too, Jamie," I said, my voice thick with unspoken words. "And you don't ever have to worry about losing me. I'm not going anywhere." He smiled softly, a warmth in his expression that seemed to wrap around me like a soft, comforting blanket. For a brief, almost sacred moment, we sat in the stillness, surrounded by a silence that felt rich with meaning. It was a sensation I hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime, a profound sense of connection, of belonging, and, unexpectedly, of love. But this wasn't the kind of love I had always known. It was something deeper, something altogether new, something that felt as if it was being written into existence in that very instant. At the time, I didn't fully understand what was unfolding between us. But now, as I look back, it's clear that something had begun to take root, something intimate and raw. A love that was slowly but surely blooming between us. As I lay there, my head resting against Jamie's shoulder, I felt an undeniable pull, an energy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Whatever this was between us, it was growing rapidly, almost at a pace that seemed too fast to comprehend. Surprisingly, though, it didn't unsettle me. Instead, it sparked an excitement within me, an inexplicable thrill that I couldn't quite put into words. The days that followed that quiet night on the couch felt different in ways I couldn't explain. Jamie and I moved around the house like we were part of a silent, carefully choreographed dance. Our daily routines were unchanged, yet there was an unmistakable shift in the air between us. A new kind of energy that hummed in the spaces we occupied. The way we interacted had subtly changed, there was a warmth in the way we passed each other. An invisible thread that seemed to pull us closer, guiding our steps, our words, our silences. I tried, with everything in me, to keep things normal. I tried to push the new, stirring feelings aside, to continue as if nothing had changed. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of that evening, the way his hand had brushed mine, the way his touch had lingered on my skin. Seemingly innocent but deeply significant. It was small, fleeting, yet it had meant everything. And with each passing day, the more I tried to ignore it, the more impossible it became. The connection between us wasn't something I could deny. And the more time we spent together, the harder it became to pretend that nothing had shifted. Jamie seemed to feel it too. I noticed the way his eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking. The subtle ways he'd draw closer when the room was empty. The way his gaze seemed to hold something unspoken. Something deeper than mere affection. There was a tenderness there. An emotion that I couldn't quite define but felt in every interaction. Every glance. Then, one evening, a few days after that quiet moment on the couch, we found ourselves in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Jamie was drying the dishes while I washed them, the rhythmic sound of the water filling the silence between us. The soft glow of the evening sun streamed through the windows, casting everything in a golden light that made the world outside seem distant, unreal, like we were wrapped in a dream. It was just the two of us, as it had always been. Yet it felt somehow different now, as if the universe itself had shifted. I handed Jamie a plate, and as he took it from me, our fingers brushed ever so briefly. That simple touch sent a wave of warmth through my body, a spark that reminded me of everything that had been building between us. I looked up at him, catching his gaze. And for a moment, everything else in the world seemed to fade away. His eyes held a gentle intensity, A quiet yet powerful emotion that made my heart skip a beat. "You okay, Mom?" he asked softly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of concern and something else I couldn't quite place. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, smiling at him, though my heart was racing in my chest. Just thinking about what? I hesitated, unsure of how to express the tangled thoughts in my mind. I didn't want to lie to him, but the truth felt complicated. "About us," I whispered, the words slipping out more easily than I expected. Jamie didn't look away. Instead, he set the dish down on the counter and turned to face me fully. His eyes, dark and searching, met mine with a depth that took my breath away. "What about us?" he asked, his voice low but steady, the words laced with something that felt like hope. My heart thudded against my ribs, and for a moment, I couldn't find my voice. The air between us was thick with tension, each word we exchanged adding to the weight that had quietly settled between us. I hadn't meant for this conversation to go in this direction. But now that we were here, I knew there was no turning back. The shift between us was undeniable, and it hung in the air like the calm before a storm. "I don't know," I whispered. "It just feels like things have changed." Jamie stepped closer, the space between us growing smaller with each step. His presence seemed to fill the room. And for a moment, all I could hear was the soft sound of our breathing, steady and synchronized. He reached out, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His touch gentle yet electric, sending shivers down my spine. "They have changed," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's not a bad thing, is it?" I looked up at him, my breath caught in my throat. The way he looked at me, with such tenderness, such care, was almost too much to bear. My mind was spinning, but all I could focus on was the proximity between us. The way his body was so close to mine, and how desperately I wanted to close the small gap between us and give in to the overwhelming pull I felt toward him. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know what this is." Jamie's hand lingered by my face, his fingers grazing my cheek in a gesture that was as intimate as it was simple. "I think it's just us," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's just you and me." I leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of his hand soothe the chaos swirling inside me. For so long, it had been just the two of us, navigating life side by side, relying on each other for support. Our bond had always been unbreakable. But now, it felt as though it was becoming something more, something neither of us had anticipated. When I opened my eyes, Jamie was still looking at me, his expression soft, vulnerable, yet full of love. "Mom, he began, his voice faltering. "I don't know how to explain it, but I care about you. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone." His words struck me like a lightning bolt, electrifying every nerve in my body. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The flood of emotions that had been building within me for weeks, months even, burst forth all at once, overwhelming me with their intensity. I had fought against them, tried to keep them contained. But standing so close to Jamie, feeling his warmth and hearing his confession, I couldn't hold it back anymore. "I care about you too," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "More than you know." His eyes softened even more, and for a moment, we stood there in silence, the world around us fading into nothingness. All that existed was the space between us. The connection that had been growing, deepening, with every passing day. Slowly, almost instinctively, I leaned into him. I noticed that he did the same. Our movements synchronized as if we were finally acknowledging the truth that had always been there. I placed my leg over his. And before I knew it, our lips met. It was tender at first, almost hesitant. But then the intensity of everything we had both been holding back poured into that kiss. And in that moment, everything else ceased to matter, only we existed. Caught in the whirlwind of our feelings, our desires, and the undeniable bond between us. It was the most overwhelming and exhilarating feeling I had ever experienced. The air was charged with an undeniable intensity, as though everything that had been silently building between us had suddenly come to life. It wasn't just excitement, it was something deeper, something more profound. It was the purest expression of the love that had slowly but steadily taken root between us over time. In the blink of an eye, everything shifted. What had started off uncertain and confusing soon escalated. And before I could even grasp what was happening, the moment was upon us. I closed my eyes, letting the rush of emotions envelop me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly alive. As though the world outside had faded away and all that remained was this singular, powerful moment. This wasn't wrong. It wasn't confusing or forced. It was love, simple, pure, and real. The kind of love that had grown naturally between us, nurtured through years of care, trust, and understanding. I kept telling myself that, even as we moved through the moments that followed. After what felt like both an eternity and an instant, Jimia pulled away, signaling the end of what we had shared. We lay there side by side, our breathing gradually slowing. And as we both processed the intensity of what had just happened, an unspoken understanding passed between us. Jimia turned toward me, a smile forming on his face as he gazed into my eyes. His smile was warm, comforting, and I could see in his eyes the same sense of quiet relief, the same acknowledgement of something profound. "We're okay, right?" he asked softly. I couldn't speak at first. My heart was full, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions surging through me. For a moment, I simply nodded, my voice barely a whisper as I responded, "Yeah, we're okay." Later, after we had cleaned up, we found ourselves sitting together on the back porch. The night wrapping around us like a comforting blanket. The stars above shimmered in the deep, dark sky. And the cool, crisp air felt like a balm to my soul. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight of all the unspoken words and feelings between us had been lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. A quiet calm that made everything feel right. We didn't speak much that night. There was no need to. Just being there together, sharing the tranquility of the night, was enough. There was no rush, no urgency. Whatever this was between us, it was unfolding at its own pace. And I was content to simply let it grow. Let it become whatever it was meant to be. Jimia reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine. I smiled, squeezing his hand gently. And we sat there in the comforting silence, watching the stars twinkle above us. It was love, real, tangible, and more powerful than I had ever imagined. As I sat there beside Jimia, holding his hand under the vast, starry sky, I knew that whatever challenges might come our way, we would face them together. We had something real now. Something deeper than either of us could have expected. As the days turned into weeks, the quiet intimacy that Jimia and I shared became more deeply ingrained in the rhythm of our daily lives. There was no need for grand declarations. No need for labels. What was happening between us didn't require explanation, it was simply there. Woven into the fabric of our everyday moments. It was in the way our eyes would meet across a room. In the way our hands would brush as we passed each other. In the quiet, lingering moments that seemed to stretch out forever. But with every passing day, I could feel the connection between us growing stronger. More undeniable. More tangible. I no longer questioned it. I no longer felt conflicted. James wasn't just my son anymore, he had become something more. He was my partner. In a way I never thought possible. And our relationship had transformed into something that felt as though it had always been meant to be, something we hadn't even known we needed. But now couldn't imagine living without. It wasn't until a rainy afternoon in late autumn that everything became clear. The sky was dark and heavy with clouds. The rain falling in a steady rhythm against the windows. The world outside seemed to blur and fade away. And the soft, comforting sound of the rain filled the house with a sense of tranquility. Jimia and I were sitting together in the living room. The fire crackling softly in the hearth. We were wrapped in a blanket. The warmth of the flames mingling with the coziness of the room, creating a peaceful, intimate atmosphere. Jimia leaned against me, his head resting gently on my shoulder. Without thinking, I ran my fingers through his hair, savoring the quiet closeness between us. The rain, the fire, the stillness of the moment, everything seemed to draw us closer, pulling us into a space where words were unnecessary. We were perfectly in tune with each other, sharing a quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken. I felt Jimia's breath slow, his body relaxing as he settled more comfortably against me. Without needing to look at him, I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. Everything between us had grown so strong, so undeniable, that it no longer mattered if we could find the right words to express it. We were beyond words. We were simply there, together. And that was enough. Then, Jimia lifted his head slightly, turning to look at me. Our eyes locked. And for a long, timeless moment, we just stared at each other. The soft glow of the fire cast a warm light on his face, and the steady rhythm of the rain became the soundtrack to this silent exchange. In that instant, I understood. I knew, deep in my heart, that what we shared was not just love, it was something far more profound. It was a bond that had evolved into something deep, something real, something that transcended the simple label of mother and son. "Mom," Jimia whispered, his voice low and filled with emotion. I didn't answer right away, I simply waited, knowing that whatever he was about to say was important. "I love you," he murmured, his hand reaching out to take mine. "Not just because you're my mom, but because of who you are, everything about you. I don't know if it's okay, if it's right, but I can't help it." His words washed over me, filling me with a warmth that reached every corner of my being. I had known this moment was coming, had felt the emotions growing stronger between us. But hearing him speak it aloud, hearing him admit the depth of his feelings, made everything more real, more undeniable. I squeezed his hand, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his fingers. "Jimia," I whispered, my voice trembling just a little. "I love you too." I've always loved you, but this is different. He nodded, his eyes searching mine for some kind of reassurance. For an answer to the unspoken question that hung between us. I don't know what this means, I continued, my voice softer now. But I know I feel the same way. And it doesn't feel wrong to me. It feels right. It feels like it's just right. Jimia's face softened. And a small, gentle smile spread across his lips. I'm glad, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'd do if you didn't. I reached up and brushed my fingers lightly against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my touch. We'll figure it out, I said quietly, my heart swelling with love and uncertainty, but also with a sense of peace. We sat there for a long moment, holding each other's gaze, letting the words we didn't need to say fill the space between us. The sound of the rain, the crackling of the fire, the weight of the unspoken emotions, we didn't need anything else. Everything had already been said. And everything was clear. Slowly, Jimia leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine. He paused for a moment, as if unsure, before gently, hesitantly, pressing his lips to mine. It was a soft kiss, filled with all the love, longing, and emotion that we had shared. And it felt like the beginning of something new, a new chapter in a story that had already been written long before. We had been holding back for so long, each moment of hesitation stretching between us like an invisible thread that kept us on the edge, waiting for the right time. There was no urgency, no rush, just the quiet, tender buildup of everything we felt for one another, slowly blossoming in its own time. It wasn't about a momentary desire or impulsive action, it was the pure, genuine expression of affection, trust, and a deep connection we had nurtured quietly over time. When Jamie finally pulled back, his eyes were filled with so many emotions, each one speaking volumes about the journey we had been on and how far we had come. I could see in his gaze the recognition of a turning point, an unspoken understanding that we had crossed a boundary, a line that, once crossed, would change everything. We could never go back to what we were before. And yet, instead of fear or regret, I felt a profound sense of peace. It was as if, in that single moment, everything that had led us here suddenly made perfect sense. We were exactly where we were always meant to be. And now that we had arrived, all the noise of the world outside seemed to vanish. There was only us, this moment. And nothing else mattered. Jamie pulled me closer, his arms enveloping me in a warmth that seemed to anchor me completely. Together, we sat there in silence, the only sound the gentle patter of the rain outside, as though nature itself was wrapping us in its embrace. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting a gentle, flickering light across the room, a symbol of warmth and safety. In that quiet cocoon of shared solitude, I knew, whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, side by side, as equals, as partners. The evening unfolded in a slow, beautiful rhythm, a blur of soft conversation, the occasional playful touch, and tender, lingering kisses. We didn't speak much about the future or try to define what was happening between us. Words didn't seem necessary. We didn't need to analyze or label what this new chapter of our relationship meant. In that moment, we didn't need anything beyond the simple truth that we were here, now, together. The present was all that mattered. and it felt like we could let everything else fall away. As the rain continued to fall in the background, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed between us in such a short time. What had once been a friendship had evolved into something so much more. Jamie, once a boy in my eyes, had grown into a man, his strength, his gentleness, his wisdom all woven together into the person who now stood beside me. And as he had changed, so had we. Our relationship had transformed into something neither of us had expected. Yet both of us had come to cherish deeply. It wasn't a change that happened overnight, but rather one that had slowly taken root, growing with each shared glance, every quiet conversation, and every touch that spoke more than words ever could. Later that night, Jamie came into my room once more. But this time it was different. There was no hesitation, no lingering doubts. He climbed into bed beside me without a word, wrapping his arms around me as though it was the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't like the other nights, when he had come seeking comfort, or perhaps reassurance. No, tonight felt different. This time, it was as though we had found a balance between us, something deeper, something stronger than anything that could ever shake us. We were no longer just two people fumbling through the uncertainties of our emotions, we had become partners. Equals in the truest sense of the word. I nestled my head against his chest, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart filling my ears. And I realized that for the first time in what felt like forever, I was completely at peace. No fears, no doubts, just a quiet certainty. Whatever this connection was, whatever it had become, I was ready for it. Jamie and I had always shared a bond. But now, it had become something entirely new. It wasn't just friendship. And it wasn't just love. It was partnership, a shared strength and understanding that promised we would face whatever came next together. As I drifted off to sleep, a soft smile tugged at the corners of my lips. It was surreal to think about everything that had brought us here, the emotions that swirled within me. But in that moment, I didn't care what anyone else might think or say. I had never felt more certain, more alive, and more whole. And that feeling, it was absolutely incredible. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me in discovering many exciting things in the upcoming videos.